Good morning, Facebook fam.
We're back. It's Sue
And Dave with Life Source Coaches, and we are here with tip number 4 for resolving conflict in the midst of quarantine.
That's right. We invite you to jump in, share the feed if you feel so led, or just give us a thumbs up or comment in the comment section. We love your feedback.
So today we're on tip number 4, and that tip that we're talking about today is risk sharing the stories we are telling ourselves in the midst of conflict.
Yeah.
Risk sharing our stories.
Yes. And so conflict occurs when we have limited resources, and oftentimes two ideas or desires or perspectives don't match up.
For example, just in the news this morning, this whole aspect of conflict in the stay inside saves lives. And we had protests all over the country about the lockdown issues and directives that are going on in various states and cities. And on one hand, this social distancing is a great preventative measure to inhibit the spreading of disease. And on the other hand, is a lack of exercise and sunshine and shared stale air makes us more susceptible to dis-ease. And so both sides have an aspect or advantage, but conflict occurs when we're not able to really understand either our story or the story of others as they bring it to the table and we experience life.
Right. So again, the tip for today is to risk sharing the story that we're telling ourselves.
When we encounter conflict, whether it's within our own thinking or within the thinking of others, our brains and our bodies feel insecure. And that insecurity brings us to a place of defensiveness. Right. And our brains in defense mode tend to blame and shame. They try to make sense of the situation. They try to formulate a story to understand so that we can respond well to restore that safety, restore that security that we all desire. The difficulty comes is that as we formulate those stories, they formulate very quickly when those emotions of fear and conflict start to occur. We assume our perspective, our assumptions are true based upon this primary need to feel safe. The difficulty is that we don't always see the big picture. And when we have differing stories from our partner or from our kids or from our government, we tend to assume that that's not safe for us. And then we tend to get to that blame or shame mode, and we get defensive, and we just assume that their intent is not for our best. It's not for our safety. And unfortunately, when we assume something, that
ass out of you and me, right? That's where it goes.
And so we want to just be careful and say, okay, instead of assuming, how do we put our stories on the table, risk telling each other what's going on inside of us, what's our perspective, what's our story, so that we can come to a place of collaboration, shared understanding, and consideration with one another.
Right. Author, speaker, shame researcher Brene Brown talks about in the research, she found out one thing that kept coming up with resilient people, and that was that they were able to verbalize their thoughts and assumptions, the story that they were telling themselves. Oftentimes those stories feel really true. As Dave mentioned, our brain tends to go really quickly to right, wrong, good, bad, and it's a protective defense mechanism. But as we are able to put our story or what's going on in our head, our thoughts, our assumptions, and verbalize them as thoughts and assumptions, as the story I'm telling myself, there is a real shift in terms of how it's presented.
And a lot of times our past feed into that story as well. We have master assumptions that we have of how life works or doesn't work well.
Right, or how it should work.
And we have buttons that get pushed. An example for Sue and I is a whole kitchen scenario.
Right. We've shared our kitchen stories before, and it is interesting how our conflict oftentimes happens there.
Yeah. I'll be cooking something and I'll go into the cupboard to get a dish or a pan, and they fall over or they fall out of the cupboard. And we mentioned that Sue's this quick cleaner, and I'm a 1 on the Enneagram, so I'm a kind of a perfectionist. Everything has to be in order and in the order that I choose for it to be in oftentimes. And so when something falls or doesn't meet my expectation, I'll grump and groan and
I jump in and I say, what's wrong? Because I'm a helper and I want to make sure I'm also a peacekeeper, love to keep everything harmonious. So what's wrong?
Right. And of course, when the bear's grumpy, the good news is to stay out of the cave. Well, when she comes into the cave to say what's wrong when the bear growls, that usually doesn't work out well.
Right. So Dave will growl, I'll go away, and we'll go on with our day until later in the day when Dave might ask, What's for dinner? Yeah, what's for dinner? And I'll say, I don't know, what is for dinner? Or let me ask the dinner fairy, what's for dinner?
Yeah, so there's probably a little bit of resentment built up in Sue over the years of blame and shame, as I'm still working on that issue of my past and how it impacts my current situation and conflicts and difficulties. And so I'll usually, the light will go on and say, okay, what's the story here? Well, let's push the pause button, and we'll sit down and we'll put our stories on a table to have some shared understanding, some shared ownership and responsibilities, and to some resolutions, some apologies.
Yes.
Reconciliation.
And we're getting a little better. Now it's getting so that we can fast forward. We don't have to go through the day and recognize what it's going to be like if we don't resolve the conflict right away. So usually a timeout is oftentimes helpful for us. So maybe going back a few minutes later, once the tension settles down a little bit.
Or maybe an hour later.
Yeah, depending on
how long it takes me to finish cooking.
We have a 24-hour rule, which we talked about before. And remember, these things that we're suggesting, we would suggest that you do them in the context of a speaker-listener scenario like we rolled out last week. So if you didn't get a chance to listen to our speaker-listener tool and tip last week, we encourage you to go back and do that.
Yeah, tip number 3 is what it was. So that's the way our brains work. When something doesn't go as planned, our brains want to protect, to defend. They aren't always rational when triggered, and they go into good or wrong, right or wrong mode.
Right.
And that's not always good for us.
Right.
It's interesting. There's some research by John Gottman.
Yeah, John Gottman talks about intent. And as we're able to share the story in our head, what's going on, we're able to expose and ask questions about intent. Gottman talked about
in his research.
In the research, yes, about intent. When he went back and asked people, even when the results weren't good, he'd ask, "What was your intention when you came at this?" And almost always, intentions were good. Intentions were positive. And when we're able to expose those and take the story out of our head and clarify assumptions and ground those assumptions into reality, we're able to undo a lot of misunderstandings.
Again, the foundation of this is that when we get into defense mode, when we're feeling unsafe, which leads to conflict, our assumption is that somebody else's difference of opinion or perspective or participation is that they don't have the best intent for us, because that's how we're feeling. But the commonality that Gottman discovered is that usually our intent is good, and when we can pull out of the story enough to remember and to reaffirm each other's intent, that helps de-escalate the situation so that we can reconcile and start to share our stories and come to compassion, understanding, and care and reconciliation.
Yeah. John Eldridge also talks about this in his book, Waking the Dead. And he talks about knowing that we're at war. There's a battle going on in the world. And to remember that the heart, especially the heart where Christ dwells, for those of us who are Christ followers, the heart is good. Mm-hmm. And so when I remember, okay, Dave's heart is good, he's for me, it shifts the perspective that we're able to come at.
Yeah. And so part of that shift that we want to help facilitate for you guys is through these tips. But we're also, Life Source Coaches is going to be sponsoring a workshop, a communication workshop that kind of puts some flesh to these bones of speaker-listener technique.
Yes, we're going to be rolling out a technique we developed called the hand of awareness. We're going to give not only some flesh and bones, as Dave said, but some handouts, tools that you can carry on throughout your relationship, and it'll set you up.
On the Life Source Coaches site on Facebook and on our website, we have a link to Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, hands-on communication workshop. You can sign up for it. Its cost is only $20 per pair. You could bring your friend,
individual,
your fiance, your
roommate,
partner, your spouse, your kids.
Yeah, whatever the case may be.
As you're all locked up together.
Right.
And
that's the 28th.
We're going to spend an hour and a half from 7 to 8:30 p.m. and help you guys walk through this and put this into practice with a little bit of help and facilitation. So
we oftentimes teach these tools in our coaching sessions. It takes a lot more time. It's more expensive. So if you can grab hold of these tools, even before a coaching session, it can be very helpful. So sign up. We'll also put a link in the comments section, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Sure. And last point is we are offering on our website a Let's Get Through It Together.
Right.
And it's a discounted coaching session. So if you find yourself that you need some help to walk through some of the conflict that's occurring in your life in this season, we'd be glad to be there for you as well. So hope you guys are staying well and staying healthy emotionally, physically, relationally as well.
So remember, risk sharing the stories in your head.
Bye, you guys. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.